Good afternoon, everyone, and I'd like to start by thanking Camilla and Elsa for inviting me to speak today and for arranging such an excellent conference with an excellent range of speakers. So I'm going to be discussing our project in all our footsteps, tracking, mapping and experiencing rights of way in post-war Britain. This is a 3-year AHRC funded project with myself and Professor Glenn O'Hara, based at Oxford Brookes University, working alongside Dr. Claire Hickman and Dr. Abby Flint at Newcastle University. So all our footsteps will examine the mapping, development, use and experience of 20th and 21st century rights of way from a historical, health and policy perspective. We'll be looking to explore the ways in which local government, civil society and the third sector were asked to record and establish the public ways network in England and Wales following the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act of 1949. We'll also consider the importance of an accessible and inclusive rights of way network in relation to access to nature and activities integral to human health and well-being, both in the past and in the present. So some of the aims and objectives of our project. What can the history of mapping rights of way in post-war England and Wales tell us about voluntary action, landscape decision-making and the barriers faced by both government action and walk-in activism? Number 2, how can a greater awareness of historical pathmaking and understanding of their cultural context as heritage or otherwise be utilised in order to facilitate much broader access to and deeper engagement with open spaces? Number 3, how has the use and experience, or not as it may well be, of rights of way affected the health and well-being of socially and physically diverse groups of people? And finally, how can focusing on the process of making and remaking rights of way help us understand about the links between citizenship and movement in the landscape? I think it's very clear from the rest of the speakers today that such questions are all the more relevant in the post-pandemic environment. An adept survey of 47 authorities in May 2020 found that over half noted an increase in the levels of public rights of way use, with 38% noting a significant increase. As such, there's an increased awareness of issues facing access to rights of way. We're not just talking about national trails or the coastal path in this project. We're looking at local access to paths and the extent of network in underserved communities. So particularly we're excited to look at the full spectrum of rights of way users, including walkers, joggers, dog walkers, horse riders, cyclists, motorbike users, 4x4 drivers, really the whole spectrum from footpaths, roadways, byways, and byways open to all traffic, or the whole range. So the research is separated into 2. I'm working on the research strand on mapping trails and forging paths, and the interconnected other strand is pathways for meaning, health and well-being. So I'll begin by talking about this strand, which I'm not working on, which has been worked on by Claire and Abby in Newcastle University. This strand focuses on the role of socially inclusive paths for health and well-being. So my colleagues will use archival and oral history to explore the change in relationship between rights of way, accessibility, land ownership and health and well-being in a historical context. So working with the Ramblers and other bodies, this strand aims to understand the relationship between the planning process and the lived experiences of path making. So Abby in particular will be looking to capture in-depth oral histories from a diverse group of rights of way users, including lone women, minority groups, disabled users, people with impairments, and those who help build and maintain the paths. This will complement the existing store of oral histories in archival collections held by the Ramblers and the British Library, and will critically engage deeper understanding of the meanings of rights of way alongside the opportunities and barriers that they can offer for people beyond the lone male walker who looms quite so large in the literature. The practice of walking will also be used to conduct mobile walk-along interviews to draw out in situ experiences and the meaning of path use amongst those interview subjects. Such immersive landscape experiences can offer invaluable opportunities for emplacing data collection, open up different ways of talking about walking and well-being. So we'll be using oral history skills to work with the Ramblers and collate histories of those involved in the earlier stages of the rights of way mapping process, which I'll speak about later, so that these voices are captured before the passage of time puts them beyond reach. This will allow us to investigate the connections between personal attachments to rights of way in relation to mental well-being and the involvement of volunteers in mapping and civic activism. So my strand will be looking very interconnected to this first strand about mapping trails and forging paths, and it seeks to reassemble the relations between the government and the elements of civic society that were invited to support the mapping of England and Wales's rights of way. So this strand really aims to understand how the ambitions of the 49 Act worked in practice. I'll principally be examining little used national files in the national and local archives, as well as records of particular county councils and organisations such as the Ramblers and Open Spaces Society. I hope to better understand the importance of the central state in remaking both urban and rural landscapes through the 20th century. A key part of this will be to better understand the process of creating the definitive map and the role of these activist citizens who continue to play a role in campaigns such as the Don't Lose Your Way project today. An emphasis on archival research on both these parts of the planning process will allow us to track why the statute eventually provided a dense map of rights of way only in some parts of the country, and why councils, charities, churches, experts and local people's interest in preserving and forging pathways coalesce only fitfully across governance networks in England and Wales. I've included some of the goals of the research project here, which include deciphering how the central British state attempted to construct this definitive map, this legal record of rights of way. And this theme will first and foremost examine the management of the 49 Act and subsequent iterations, but also the role of nationalised industries and quasi-governmental bodies such as the Forestry Commission. Number two, how the different parts of the voluntaristic civic society interacted in reaction to attempts to implement the 49 Act. And he'll be looking to knit together how perhaps they failed to mobilise local authorities, look at experts such as surveyors and cartographers, elected parish councillors, local groups and landowners' views, since relations between all these groups varied quite substantially across England and Wales. Particularly as well, we'll be looking at different traditions of localism in modern English and Welsh governance. This theme will demonstrate how the image of top-down control in the post-war era was actually in some ways bottom-up policy, managed in a complex manner, given the contrasting shapes of policy networks, local governance and land ownership in different parts of the country. We'll also be looking at the role of national participatory bodies such as the National Footpath Society, founded in 1865, Federation of Rambling Clubs, which folded into the Ramblers Association in 1935, as well as the National Trust and how they dealt with landowners' resistance to more access. For me, this is really a project about people. It's people who shape the environment around them. I'm keen to draw out some of these stories. So to tackle some of these questions, we have to first look back at developments in the late 19th and early 20th century, because these proved pivotal to shaping this 1949 Act. This is a period of incredible change, and this image really illustrates the growth of citizen urbanisation through the 19th century, to the point that 1901, 80% of the population of England and Wales lived in urban settlements. It's no coincidence that this period also sees really the formation of a strong environmental lobby. You've got the formation of the National Trust, the Open Spaces Society, Country Landowners Association, National Farmers Union and the Ramblers, of course. And all these organisations look towards the countryside with the goal of preserving and conserving or providing greater access to it. But really, what is the countryside? The countryside, the image of the English countryside is of course familiar to many people today. Healy in 1999 argued that the countryside has a peculiar place in British culture, embodying and symbolising some of the essential qualities of what it is to be British. I think all of us can readily visualise the green fields grazed by cattle, split by hedges and trees and spotted with thatched cottages. But this image is really used, it's a dream of the highly urbanised country invented by poets, tourist guides and landscape designers in the 19th century and promoted since then by a professionalised middle class. The defence of the countryside is embodied in the powerful pressure groups highlighted earlier and underpins much of the landscape conservation policies in Britain through the 20th century, from green belts and national parks to areas of outstanding natural beauty. However, in many ways, it bears little relation to the actual conditions of rural life in 19th and early 20th century Britain. And really the idealised village is now more likely to be home to urban commuters and business activities technologically freed from the need to be in a city. And that's all the more prevalent in this post-pandemic era of working from home. So much has been written about this subject, and it's hoped that we can add to this literature in a novel way, because access to rights of way and attempts to definitively define such have been so important. So this countryside that Patrick Abercrombie sought to defend in the 1940s, the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, had the overall objective of safeguarding agricultural land from urban growth, and gave us the infamous green belts, the original one on the left here, and then the current, how it stands currently on the right. And it was this period after the Second World War that saw increased debates concerning urbanisation, particularly the loss of agricultural land and the idea that food production, the nation should be able to feed itself. And this was used by the NFU particularly to argue for increased agricultural support. So alongside these developments, you've also got the countryside growing as a location for recreation, not just for the middle classes, but particularly in the north for the working classes. And here we have an image of the Sheffield Claren Ramblers, who are quite large group, and one of many such walking and rambling clubs and societies formed in this period. So it's really the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act was formed very much in the shadow of these experiences, with increased calls for greater access to the countryside have been building since the 1930s. And really you have several influential policies, some of which here on a rather terrible picture. But really these are taken together, and these create the National Park and Access to the Countryside Act of 1949, which is so pivotal to the project we're looking at, passed by Clement Attlee's post-war government and aimed at reconstructing Britain. So recording rights of way became increasingly important as the population grew. More mobility in the population also brought a greater need for rights to be formalised outside of these oral traditions quite locally, and put into a definitive map. And this really forms part of a much wider and longer process from the medieval period to the 20th century, where written records supersede memory as the primary form of legitimising legal change. That's explored in Clancy's seminal book, From Memory to Written Record, and that's really what we're seeing in this period. So to give you some background to the definitive maps, the lines were drawn quite literally with national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. And really, you've got the state trying to codify such rights in a definitive map, finally a legal record of public rights. This obviously was a mammoth task, and we want to understand the mechanics of its implementation, the extent to which the construction of the definitive map was managed centrally by the state, or whether it's actually representative of a movement of power to being more devolved and representing local communities, and the extent to which those local communities actually represent the diversity within those communities. So the 49 Act set out the definitive map process and how it was to proceed. Each surveying authority was to complete a survey of all alleged rights of way in their area, followed by a draft map of all rights of way which were reasonably alleged to exist. I think these two stages are quite important to point out, because I'm sure we'll find instances of paths being excluded at that stage when the authorities published their draft maps. The 49 Act was supported by guidance such as circulars from the ministries and booklets by organisations. Of course, the Open Spaces and Footpath Preservation Society, as it was then known, was very influential in this period, and was consulted alongside the government to produce some of these booklets. So this is an example of one, Surveys and Maps, Public Rights of Way, which provided additional guidance to local authorities to address any of the problems that they faced further on in the process that weren't foreseen originally. For instance, the Ministry of Town and Country Planning published in their circular that surveying authorities were required to plot the draft map paths over which they consider rights of way exist or reasonably alleged to exist, and that they were to include all these paths and not omit any at that stage, because I think some authorities were looking to pot through changes quicker. So such flexibility, of course, led to inconsistencies in the implementation of the definitive map, and that's really what we're seeing across the country. So I'll be interrogating how local, regional and national organisations interacted with one another and how they produced different changes. So really the district and parish councils were asked to gather this information and it was an immense amount of work. They really were looking to gather information from enclosure walls, old ordnance survey maps, tithe maps, parish maps. Whether or not they consulted these as much as they should have is another question and something which, as Jack mentioned earlier, really becomes clear because so many are now found to have been left off the maps. So really, I've been examining some of the records of the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. This was the body responsible for overseeing the definitive map process. And it's clear that the Minister was especially eager that national park areas be completed as soon as possible. And there was a progress report given on the 31st of March 1965, produced this map, which I think shows quite clearly the progress was very uneven. You got areas such as Cambridgeshire and County Durham who were on their second revision of maps, whereas areas like the Isle of Ely and the East Riding of Yorkshire were yet to finish their draft maps. I'm investigating 3 counties, Cheshire, East Riding of Yorkshire and Essex, all of which have diverse and unique histories and which we hope will provide a broad range of examples. I've begun by examining Essex, an anciently enclosed county, which has incredible contrast between its intensely urbanised areas, now part of Greater London, to rural areas in the north. Here we have its definitive map. You've got footpaths in red, bridleways in blue, byways in mustard, and restricted byways in purple. I'm investigating how this map was created and the extent to which it was shaped by local, regional, and national politics. So we can perhaps make better sense of the county if we divide it into its parishes and colour these according to the length of public rights of way present in each. So here we can see quite a stark contrast between parishes with fewer rights of way in the blues and greens to the east to areas with more rights in the oranges and reds to the west of the county. This map as well gives perhaps a clear impression that the Essex is divided into really pockets of quite intense areas of a dense network of public rights of way. And here I've overlaid the road network to give a clear impression that it's not just large urban settlements really that actually correspond with areas of dense a dense network. It's actually other areas outside of those urban settlements. So to take one example, Radwinter in the north, which is just for reference up here, so an area with quite a lot of rights of way, and here you can see that it's a village where almost every field boundary is recorded as a right of way. So we'll be looking as part of this project, or I will as my part, really to look at the reasons behind this. Were landowners especially keen to denote particular paths as public rights of way? Was this parish council especially officious in the area? So why were so many recorded? If we compare this to an area, to go back, this area here to the west of Witham, where there's a distinct lack of rights of way. And this map is actually at the same scale as the one before, and you can see that there's really quite a dense network here and then a very sparse network here. And one reason behind this could be the fact that it's joined by multiple parishes. So if you look at the parish map here, it's joined by Turling, Witham and Hatfield, Peveril. So that could be a possible factor in the reason that perhaps rights weren't recorded in the 50s, 60s and 70s. Here you can see an older parish map from 1851. Obviously this is a century before the definitive map, but it highlights that this particular area was not necessarily fixed in the minds of the local community. So particularly this area here, although you do have obviously Kate showed earlier the beating of the bounds in particular areas of the country. Sometimes the boundaries aren't fixed or do change over time, so that could be a possible factor. Of course, there could be other factors at play. You've got here This is Turling Place. You can sort of see a distinct sort of semicircle here. That's a close-up view of a lovely Georgian house, Turling Place, the seat of Lord Rayleigh, a family named Strutt. They were farming an estimated 25,000 acres in the early 20th century. To give you some context, that's the size of Disney World over in Florida. Huge landowners, and one half of the property consultants, Strutt and Parker, so very, very influential. So you can see note the semicircle ha-ha here to keep animals out, and by chance, Merle actually published this photo on the Twitter thread, and this image actually is from the 1950s. So this is the house in the 1950s, precisely at the period in which the draft map would have been being created. So it's interesting to see that, that's a very visible image of perhaps the powers that influenced this process. So I've been looking to examine some of the local parish records, because these are the bodies that are actually tasked with completing this definitive map. And so I've been looking across Essex to get a clearer impression of the process, to draw out some of these local experiences. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be examining localism and how this information is both handed down and up. So the communications between the various bodies and the issues they faced are really important. This is an example of a draft map handed out by the Essex County Council, and I'm yet to find out why they've included private road used as public path, because that's not technically in the 1949 Act, but it will be interesting to see how different authorities dealt with these sorts of issues. So yeah, I've been looking, this is an example of Boxted, a parish in the north of Essex, and this country planning advisor provided a map to the parish council on the right here with this letter, and it's important to note that these maps aren't handed down on high. The draft maps for the definitive map don't come from nowhere. They're coming obviously from the local memory of parishioners, but they're also coming from the Rights of Way Act of 1932, which previously carried out surveys to collect some of these footpaths, bridleways and byways. So how the work really was completed, here's an example of really what the parish council is finally producing. So this is a parish, Great Henny, Great and Little Henny in Essex as well, and this is what they produced really, an OS map drawn underneath, and then footpaths and bridleways coloured in, and you can see that this is. Oh, my slides are out of whack, but oh, alas, I thought I had an image of the modern definitive map, but essentially it fades quite nicely into the modern definitive map. So you can see that actually what they were surveying back in the 50s and 60s actually does translate into the modern network. Quickly here, this is literally part of the process, the initial process, and you can see here that quite often it's named Footpath Survey, and you've got regularly it's headmistresses, head teachers of schools, teachers, people that sit on the parish council going out and completing this survey, and they're regularly calling it the Footpath Survey. So already right at the outset, there's I think confusion about what exactly is being recorded, and of course footpaths loom so large that they're the largest rights of way. So I think sometimes you get in particular areas bridleways and other rights that maybe are left out a little bit. Here's another quite nice example of the literal work on the ground done. This is again an example from Little Henny, where someone is going around and noting each path, whether it's signposted, whether it's in good condition or bad condition, and noting how they're going on. And here again is quite a nice example of really how developments go along. So you've got obviously a huge amount of house building in this period, and this is an instance of which you've got a footpath being diverted to better accommodate with this network, with this housing estate. So to finish, this is our website, allourfootsteps.uk. I really would encourage, please do get in touch if anyone has any interesting examples from their local community, or if you can get in touch in any way. And we're really looking to hopefully really evaluate how the process, the definitive map process has occurred over the past 77 years, really looking towards the future and influencing better policy, hopefully, as we go forward. So thanks very much for listening, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.